Hello, and welcome back to Off the Deaton Path. I'm your host, Stan Deaton, with the Georgia Historical Society, and we welcome you to this podcast for the week of April 23rd, 2026. My very special guest today is author and historian Daniel Rood of the University of Georgia, talking about his new book about the history of the plantation in America. Daniel Rood holds a BA in English Literature from the University of Pittsburgh, an MA in American Studies from New York University, and a PhD in History from the University of California, Irvine. He is an associate professor of history at the University of Georgia and specializes in the history of Atlantic slavery and its intersections with the histories of technology, agriculture, and capitalism. He teaches the pre-1865 half of the U.S. Introductory Survey, as well as upper division courses in the Atlantic World and the U.S. Civil War. He also co-directs a project there called Dirty History, an interdisciplinary workshop in agriculture, environment, and capitalism, which convenes monthly at UGA. You can find out more about it at dirty-history.org. Dan has published numerous articles and essays over the years and is the author of two books, the first of which is entitled The Reinvention of Atlantic Slavery: Technology, Labor, Race, and Capitalism in the Greater Caribbean, published by Oxford University Press in 2017. His second book, and the one he is here to talk about with me today, is entitled In the Shadow of the Great House: A History of the Plantation in America, published by W. Norton on March 17th of this year, and it is an absolute tour de force. The book was reviewed in the Wall Street Journal on April 3rd, 2026, and Fergus Bordwick wrote this, and I quote, "A provocative history of the plantation, one that spans continents and centuries. Rood is an able guide, piloting us deftly through the economic and cultural intricacies in language that is brisk and well-paced. He has a knack for turning seemingly unconnected subjects into elegant prose. It is a powerful record of an institution that was more dynamic and resilient than history suggests," unquote. And the book received starred review in Kirkus Reviews, which called it, quote, "an important and revelatory work that brings economic history to life with narrative and nuance," unquote. It is a terrific book, and I highly commend it to you. My conversation with Daniel Rood begins now. Dan Rood, welcome to our podcast.
Hey Stan, great to be here.
So, every book like yours begins with a big question or a problem that the author is trying to solve or to get to. What was the big question that led you to want to write this big book about such a big subject?
That's a good question.
Sorry to spring that on you
I
right at the
think
beginning.
no, it's okay. I think that I typically don't start with my question figured out in a crystal clear manner. The questions actually sort of emerge in the process of doing the research. And that was the case here as well. I think that the project arose from an awareness that, there's been all this really great work on slavery and the lives of enslaved people over the past couple decades, some really great histories of particular commodities like, cotton or sugar or rice. But the plantation itself hasn't really been the object of close study for quite some time. I think it's been 30 some years. And like so that's the sort of original impetus for the project. And then as I started working on the project, it came to seem like more and more of a glaring error to me, because especially non-historians might think about something like racism or something like slavery, sort of independent from the plantation or as something that existed. They're kind of adjuncts or twins of each other. But in fact, it's really the profits that can be made from this particular kind of spatial technology of the plantation that create modern slavery and modern racism. So I think knowing that those two, incredibly tragic, really formative aspects of modernity emerge from this particular social space made the question of understanding the history of the plantation all the more urgent.
Mm-hmm. For those coming to this book simply through the title, they will see that the subtitle is A History of the Plantation in America. You have the Great House in the title itself, and they think, oh, this is going to be a history of the white people and their
Hmm.
homes and what they collected and what they did and their culture and all of that kind of thing. It's not that at all. Um, it is. I don't even know how to quite describe this. I sort of came to this with an open mind and just immediately just was fascinated by what you were trying to do here. And I wrote this down in the inside of the book. The word that defines this subject is exploitation
Hmm.
of people, of labor, of land, resources, governments to maximize profits, power, and racial control.
Mm.
Um, and of course, that's not the only thing that's going on here. But the other thing that emerges quickly is anyone who thinks this is a history that ends in 1865. That to me is really the most innovative part of your book. And I ask this question broadly: have any scholars ever connected, as you do, going all the way back to the Portuguese in the 16th century, connected that to modern, I don't even know how to describe them, multinational corporate factories,
Hmm.
agribusiness or otherwise? Has anybody ever done that before? Are you breaking new ground here?
I think so. I mean, not that I've really seen. I mean, I think is there's a general picture of certain parts of that coming from other historians, but especially coming from the people who experienced those plantations. A great example of that is my chapter on this big cotton boom that happens in Cold War California,
Mm-hmm.
where a cohort of Deep South cotton planters and landowners particularly from Georgia and South Carolina, in the wake of the boll weevil and other issues, kind of decamp for the Central Valley, the San Joaquin Valley in California. And they become these leading national cotton planters there all the way up until the 1980s. And there's a great scholar who interviews one of the workers on these large plantations. I think it's the Boswell property, and the Boswells were a big slave owning family in Greene County, Georgia, who then go and become this huge kind of cotton planting syndicate out in California. And this guy, Santiago Delgado, says he's being interviewed, and he says they never called it a plantation, but that's what it was.
Mm.
Right. So they
Mm-hmm.
wanted to refuse that term and all the kind of negative freight and association that came along with it, but he knew better. He knew that the sort of fundamental tenets of the plantation, which include large scale monoculture, which include, as you very eloquently said, dependence on a racialized and kind of legally disadvantaged workforce, the focus on short-term profits over long-term sustainability, that he saw all those things there and he had lived them in his own body. And so he knew what to call it.
In the 20th century, to
Yeah, no,
reiterate that
that's like in the
point. Yeah.
1970s, I think,
Yes.
that he says that.
Yes. Yes. And we're going to talk about that. I also wrote down because you take us through where this comes from, and I'm going to get a definition from you in just a moment. But planters needed labor. That labor needed eventually to be unfree and cheap.
Hmm.
The labor had no rights. That was absolutely crucial so that it could be exploited ruthlessly, really, as property. And labor, of course, becomes synonymous with race, of
Hmm.
course, black, and then other things in the 20th century. So, for definitional purposes, and so people listening to this will know what do you mean by the word plantation? If you can describe that, you even use the word an economic machine at one point, which I wrote, and I love that.
Yeah,
What is a plantation besides people think of Gone with the Wind still? What do
right.
you mean when you talk about plantation?
I like to contrast plantations to farms. People sometimes think, if they think of plantations in economic terms, they think of it as sort of a large farm, right? But in fact, the plantation is such a surprising thing to have emerged because it sort of breaks all of the rules of early modern farming. So if you take your average, let's say, farm in the British countryside in the 1600s, most of them are producing a lot of different goods on different types of land. And they're always diversifying because in pre-modern farming, the risks of crop failure are pretty high, and not knowing what's going to happen with weather, not having fertilizers. So the way most kind of peasant farmers handled that was to make sure that, first of all, they didn't depend on markets too much, that they could supply a lot of their own needs themselves, and
Mhm.
that they grew and processed a lot of different things. Plantations arise at the same time in the 1600s, um, much more in a hmm, sorry. They arise at the same time, and they're actually breaking all those rules. They are highly specialized,
Mhm.
and they are entirely sort of precariously dependent on long distance, often global markets, both for like all the money that they make by selling this one thing, whether it's sugar, or rice or tobacco, and they're selling that for cash and then purchasing from long distance markets all the things that they need to make that plantation run. So, first of all, plantations aren't just big producers of one single good, they're also really large pre-modern consumers when they first start because they're
Mhm.
not making any of their own food. There's this great story from the 1650s, when the British Empire under Oliver Cromwell are going around the Caribbean trying to conquer these different Spanish colonies and make them British colonies. And this one naval officer goes to British Barbados where he's hoping to refuel and has to report from home, hey, this was a really disappointing visit because they don't have any provisions. They buy all of their own.
Mm.
And to have a society in the 1600s that is sort of globalized and locked into and dependent upon global markets for the daily needs of the populations there is extremely unusual and kind of very quintessential to the plantation. So I basically say that a plantation is not a farm because farms exist to make things and plantations exist to make money. Sometimes they are making things on the way to making money, but it's really about making money. Um, and so a lot of the early planters, like plantation builders and establishers, had almost none of them had been farmers before. If they had been involved in any kind of economic activity, it was often they'd often been merchants. So in Georgia and South Carolina in the colonial era, a lot of the early rice planters had started out as merchants, often slave traders. And when they make
Mhm.
their fortune, they then become rice planters. And I think that they bring their kind of merchant mindset of basically existing to sort of buy cheap and sell dear and to move commodities around. And they bring that mindset into the world of making goods. And they
Mhm.
also bring their knowledge of sort of like racial power and racial hierarchy into that as well. So it brings a kind of merchant's commercial mindset into the earth itself in a very new and unusual kind of way.
And take us back to the beginning. These things have not existed since time immemorial. Farming certainly has. We know
Right.
that the roots of agricultural societies go back millennia. But the idea of the plantation, as you have described it, and we're going to get into what these places grew, what they sold, but where did it begin? What makes it? And I would ask a dual question: what made it so adaptable across
Mm,
geographies, across time, and across place?
mm.
Where take us to the beginning? Who had this idea first? So who's responsible for this, if you will? Was it the Portuguese?
Well, I think there's a good argument to be made that it's the Portuguese, not because they're sort of culturally different or particularly innovative or particularly brutal, but because they find themselves at the nexus of a couple of different new phenomena in the late 1500s. They are exploring down the west coast of Africa, looking for new sources of gold and silver. And I think that sort of pursuit of coin is always crucial to understanding what plantation builders are doing. And they stumble upon an uninhabited island off the coast of what is now Gabon in Central Africa, and they name it Sao Tome, St. Thomas. And they're both like voyaging to the mainland of Central Africa looking for gold and silver, and also thinking of other ways to make money. And they, in the 1500s, build this new kind of system in that place. And it's built on two new ideas of bottomlessness, of endless availability. One is that they pioneer the purchase of large numbers of enslaved people off the coast of the mainland and bring them out to the island of Sao Tome as workers. They are building sugar plantations there, and it's mostly merchants who are doing this. And what they're trying to do is capture and sort of grow a new kind of consumer market in Europe itself. Now let's think about why sugar is so important. If you think about the big sort of long distance traded commodities in the medieval world, it might be wool to make cloth or grain to make bread. Those are two kinds of commodities where the consumer market can only grow so big because someone can only wear a certain number of pairs of pants per year. They can only eat a certain number of loaves of bread per year. But sugar is a drug crop, which means that the ceiling on its consumption is endless, is sort of without a ceiling. And so there's this kind of a very capitalist dream of infinite growth of a consumer market by making a commodity that had previously in the medieval period been a luxury spice brought in from Muslim realms and actually making it a mass commodity, making it cheap by making it in large amounts and making it very low cost to produce by using slaves to do it. On the other hand, you have Portuguese officials who are reporting on the slave markets of the coast of Central Africa, actually using similar terms, saying very specifically that the supply of slaves appears to be bottomless because of this huge population of enslaved people. So it's the sort of like tragic marriage of these two like quintessentially capitalist notions of the possibility of infinite growth, an infinite growth of the number of cheap laborers without rights who aren't from the place where they're working, married to the infinite growth in a consumer market in a new kind of like massively available luxury. And bringing those two things together is enough of an incentive for these merchants who in an earlier world hadn't really troubled themselves too much with the sort of grimy, gritty world of making stuff. They just wanted to buy it cheap and sell it expensive someplace else. It was enough of an incentive for them to get involved in the business of making sugar and building plantations. So in Sao Tome, by the mid 1550s, you have this wholesale ecological transformation that has happened where what before Portuguese colonization, there had been this extremely diverse tropical island ecosystem that 30, 40 years later, at least the lowland parts of the island are planted coast to coast in this single crop of sugar. And they're exploiting, tens of thousands of enslaved people to make it. And that's where I think the plantation really begins.
And everybody else is paying attention to this, the Spanish. And I was going to say, I actually have sitting on my desk. This is a copy of Charles Boxer's book from the mid 60s, The
Oh,
Portuguese Seaborne Empire. I just recently got this
yeah,
in part because of mining your bibliography. Uh, we forget that the Portuguese were such a big player in
right.
16th century exploration and colonization, but the Spanish were certainly paying important, close attention to how this worked as we know. And if you could just for a minute talk about how sugar really revolutionized the diet, everything. I mean, it became the
Mm,
most important commodity coming out of what we think of as the Caribbean. The Spanish exploited this. This was really the driver, I think, of the economy from the time period that you mentioned, and
yeah,
and
yeah,
changed everything about the way people ate and the desire for this. It created a market, as you said, that wasn't there
right, exactly.
and still exists today.
Yeah, and yeah, definitely. And th so I think I'm glad you brought up Boxer and the Portuguese Seaborne Empire, and the Spanish as well, because the big question is like, the Spanish have this huge landed empire in the Americas, but they don't really get into large scale sugar production themselves until much later, until Cuba, like after the Haitian Revolution, like in the
Mm,
1790s. And my argument is that, the Spanish are basically the first operators and the big actors in New World conquest, and they find what everybody else wanted. They find large scale silver mines and access to gold as well. That's what all of these different Western European states, like the British, the French, the Dutch, the Portuguese, etc., are all sort of hoping for. And if we know our colonial North American history, we know that's why Virginia is founded because they have that hope as well.
hmm.
So to me, the plantation arises as a sort of consolation prize for the failure to find precious metals.
Interesting.
We
Okay.
don't, so the parts of South America that the Pope quote unquote gives to the Portuguese. They actually, interestingly, there's a big gold rush there, but not till the late 1600s. So until that time, they really pioneer sugar production in the Americas in northeastern Brazil. And that's also why they're exploring down the coast of West Africa. But what they find ultimately after a couple centuries is that even though plantations are kind of this substitute for like the promise of like a silver gold paradise in the colonial world that never materializes, um, planters and European policymakers ultimately discover that plantations are actually a way of making a lot more coin than even the control of mines themselves. And again, we need to think about the physical nature of the commodities themselves and how they fit into economies. Because what the Spanish find out by, probably the early to mid 1600s, um, is that the more precious every silver coin that you mint and release into an economy decreases the value of every coin that's already in circulation, right? We all know this, that the more money a government puts out, the more things inflate, the less value that coin has. But with commodities where you can always be sort of like, cultivating dependence, like with tobacco and with sugar and with rum, these plantation goods, and th that kind of inflationary process is really delayed, right? So you can make money for a much longer time by always trying to make the good a little bit cheaper, to make it available to larger swaths of the European population. And that to me is really the birth of modernity. When capitalists figure out that the way to really make money isn't to take a small number of East Asian luxuries and sell them for lots of money to a tiny wealthy minority in Western Europe, but to try to use plantations to make luxury goods into mass produced consumer items that much bigger parts of the European population can indulge in. And that's really like the sort of key discovery. It's really, I call it like English bellies. English bellies are always pushing the new plantation boom and a sort of seeming endlessly growing desire for imported goods from the plantation
Hmm.
world. And I think we're living in the world that follows from that discovery.
I know we tend to think a consumer culture grew here in the United States almost post World War II, the rise of mass advertising and all of this.
Mm,
But you make it quite clear that this has very deep roots, hundreds of years ago, and we've just sort of perfected the model.
mm,
Um, so as you mentioned, the Portuguese are in Brazil in particular, and the Spanish competing with the other Western European powers for control of the Caribbean, which becomes really the most important part. We think of the North American colonies as being the crown jewel of the Caribbean, and
right.
they become killing fields as well because
Mm,
they need labor, and those sugar plantations become death camps.
right.
Uh, what happens in the Caribbean? Because again, we both know that the most readers of this book are unfamiliar with what happened in the Caribbean, the importance of it in European power politics and global politics, and its important role it played in the plantation.
Right. So it comes down to another small island that becomes of outsized importance in the history of the British Americas, and that's Barbados.
Hmm.
So Barbados passes from Spanish to English hands in 1623. Uh, but the transition that happens, I would say, from about 1650 to the 1680s, uh, is 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 fascinating, and incredibly brutal. Basically, when the British take over the island for the first couple decades, it's populated with small British and Irish farmers who are growing some tobacco, but raising animals and growing corn and engaging in different kinds of subsistence farming. But what's happening in England at that same time is really important, and that's the English Civil War, otherwise known as the English Revolution. During that time, there is a lot of class conflict in England because there are new groups of large landowners, often of gentry or even aristocratic status, who are trying to enclose their lands and push out peasants and exercise new kinds of power over their own properties. In ways similar to what we will soon see in Barbados. But because of the English Civil War, the royalist planters in particular are foiled, often by peasant resistance to their projects of enclosure and drainage. And so some of the first British major sugar planters are actually landowning aristocrats who basically get their estates kind of ransacked by rebellious peasants and small farmers, and find Barbados as a place where they can kind of make up for lost time. And I think they start to build kind of Portuguese style plantations. In a way to kind of make up for they sort of feel like their righteous birthright of being powerful landowners was stolen from them in England, and they insist on making that good in Barbados. And they sort of import the Portuguese model of sugar plantations from Sao Tome and from Brazil, and scale it up to an unprecedented level in Barbados.
Mm.
So between 1650 and the 1680s, about 100,000, I still can't believe this number, about 100,000 African men, women, and children are brought across the Atlantic to staff these new plantations. That is, so in that small island, that is far more than the total number of slaves imported into the Carolinas, and Virginia combined. So there's this small place that is of outsized importance. And if you look by the 1680s, they've been so successful in this that not only is the island of Barbados, at least the sort of most low-lying areas, planted sort of the plantations are like cheek to jowl, but the fortunes that have been made are so fantastic that the wealth per capita for free white people in Barbados, is larger by many times than the wealth per capita in Virginia or even New England. So Barbados becomes this kind of center of gravity where, even though geographically it's small, and we think about it mostly as a place where tourists sometimes go on vacation, it's really the epicenter of the British Empire. And it is, in fact, the reason why British North America itself gets established, especially the Carolinas, and surprisingly enough, New England. New England, of course, is first established for reasons of religious contestation and religious freedom. But those colonists, those Puritan colonists, basically they need to have a sort of economy that works to make their settlement sustainable. And they find their sort of secret to existence and longevity in exporting their own goods to Barbados and eventually to Jamaica as well. So if you look at New England's major exports in the colonial era, like lumber, like cattle, like grain, the vast majority of their exports are going not to the mother country of England, but to these sort of needful highly specialized plantation societies in the Caribbean. So even parts of the colonial world we don't think of as part of the plantation world very much are.
Hmm. Yes, and you make that quite clear that they are all part of this nexus, all part of this capitalist system, even though they are not enslaving other people on such a
Right.
large scale.
Yeah.
And moving to those North American colonies, as we move chronologically through time, we tend to think in our national narrative, because we've heard this over and over, that this all began in Virginia in 1619. You make it clear, really, that the plantation system, as we came to think of it, was imported from Barbados to this part of the country where I'm
Mhm.
sitting in South Carolina and Georgia, really before large scale plantations existed in Virginia. Take us through that, because the Barbadians were very important in the settlement of South Carolina. Those names are still found there today in Charleston.
Absolutely. Uh, the Drayton name is just one of many
Hmm.
whose immediate parents had been sugar planters in Barbados. And I'm glad that you asked that because the Barbados Carolina connection shows your your earlier question about what makes plantation so adaptable
Hmm.
um, is what I think of as this kind of dialectic or this tension between the fabulous profits that planters are able to make and also the ways in which they're unsustainable. So in Barbados, what happens, and for the pre-modern world of the late 1600s, it's so remarkable that a boom and a bust can happen so rapidly. We think of sort of AI booms and busts and the dot-com boom and bust as being very
Hmm.
modern things. But the first booms and busts are really coming out of plantation and colonial goods. So what happens in Barbados is the profits to be made are so large that a lot more people come to Barbados to make planters of themselves. A lot of indentured servants get their freedom and then start to compete for land with established planters. And as early as the 1650s, wealthy elites are already feeling overcrowded and are predicting we will soon need new kind of larger horizons for our ventures. So the first thing they do is argue to Oliver Cromwell that the Spanish colony of Jamaica and mainland areas Guyana need to become part of the British Empire because we need more space. Um, and so some of the early planters who feel hemmed in or crowded in Barbados completely spearhead the early colonization of Carolina, which will eventually be split into North and South Carolina in 1715. Interestingly, they don't just land there and start planting big rice plantations. They are thinking about the Barbadian model, not necessarily as that they're going to immediately replicate, but as such um, a big market opportunity that they want to make Carolina a satellite supplier of the sugar plantations of the Caribbean. So their early ventures are in enslaving Native Americans and exporting them to Caribbean plantations, in using enslaved Africans to harvest timber, because the sugar plantations are voracious consumers of fuel wood to process their sugar, um, and of sort of boxes and barrels and hogsheads and all these wooden products that are needed to package the sugar. And so that's how they really start. Something interesting happens along the way, and that is the enslaved people who they have imported to do a lot of this work, and they're sort of saying, well, you're going to have to feed yourselves, start using parts of the South Carolina coast that many English planters had thought of as useless. In the English countryside, swampy, marshy areas are thought of as quote unquote waste. You can't grow wheat on it, you can't graze sheep on it. So the only thing you can do is completely drain it to make it useful. Planters, English settlers start to see African women in particular using what they had thought of as wasteland to grow small amounts of rice in similar ways as they had done in their homes in West Africa. and they start to notice this. What's happening at the same time is enslaved African women who are being forced to cook for white families are, in a sense, teaching English settlers how to eat white rice because there's no rice consuming culture in England. So it really doesn't make sense for them to have started to become big rice planters without this African influence. So some of the major dishes that we associate with Charleston food are actually Senegambian dishes in origin. One of the first uses, interestingly, that English settlers have for white rice is to pound it into rice flour. And so, why are they doing that? They're doing that because in England, the notion of the good life, if you had made it, it meant that you ate white bread. They try to grow wheat in the low country, they sort of fail, and they're kind of forced more or less to start farming like the Native Americans, whom they also observed, and start using corn. But they thought of as this yellowish kind of cornbread as kind of trashy people's food. And so enslaved African cooks are able to add a sort of whitening agent to cornbread to make it look more like the good life bread that English settlers wanted. Over time, they start to scale up the production of rice and turn it into a plantation good in many ways on the Barbadian model, where they're really exporting massive amounts of rice to Northern European and Southern European consumers. So we start to see the Barbadian model where you have actually a black majority population in the South Carolina colonies, as you had in Barbados, and you have a small number of very wealthy landowners dominating the colony, both in its politics and in its landholding patterns.
Yeah, I was going to say they also are enslaving massive amounts of people. And it takes hold here in Georgia, and really the trustee experiment here in Georgia just had no chance because by the time Georgia was settled, South Carolina had been prospering for 50 years, and it was a fool's errand to think that they could prevent that model from coming here. And you make it clear that they do, and that both South Carolina and Georgia are strongly connected, building on the work of other scholars,
Yeah,
strongly connected to the Caribbean, more so than to the other colonies here on
yeah,
mainland North America,
right.
while they're displacing Native Americans, which is also, this is important as we follow this chronologically. There's this rapacious need always for land, because to go back to that word I use, exploitation, these planters, and you mentioned this already, they don't have access to what we think of as modern agricultural techniques of rotation and certainly fertilizer and pumping things into the soil so you can grow over and over and over. So they need land. So take us through what happens in Virginia. They start growing tobacco and then eventually wheat. But all the while, of course, they're enslaving and exploiting the people who are already there.
Right. Um, so yeah, land theft, land conquest is always the first step in the building of a plantation boom. And in colonial South Carolina, in colonial Georgia, in colonial Virginia, that's always a big part of the picture. What's interesting about the Virginia case and the Carolina case as well is it's actually like a land contest that I would say is split into three groups. There are Native Americans, but there are also small holding independent kind of yeoman farmer whites who are not particularly wealthy, who are also competing over land with a small elite who end up being the plantation builders. And so it seems like the first step is often pushing Native Americans off the land, and the second step is pushing small white farmers off of the land
Mm-hmm.
to make these big plantation districts. And that's to a large extent what happens in the Tidewater regions of Virginia that are slowly but surely given over or taken by large tobacco planters by like the 1680s, 1690s. And gradually they transition their own labor force to one that depends on white indentured servants to one that depends on African slaves. So we start to see by a sort of from a sort of a different set of origins, the same kind of process unfolds in Virginia as well.
Hmm. And so the American Revolution comes, and you make it clear that ideologically, in some ways, it did weaken notions of enslavement. And then this thing called the Haitian Revolution happens, which
Mhm.
has an enormous influence on the development of the American plantation going into the 19th century. Walk us through that, if you will.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is one of many examples where enslaved people rose up to try to destroy the system that oppressed them and to seek freedom. What's really interesting about the plantation process is that planters, you know, they're always aware that a violent uprising is something they're asking for, and something that is a risk of their kind of way of life. But a big rebellion is rarely an occasion, even though after a big rebellion, there are some people who will say, "Oh, geez, it seems like it's really a bad idea. It's quite dangerous. Maybe we shouldn't do it again." But the caution is always thrown to the wind. And interestingly, that's really the sort of origin point of slavery, sort of back in colonial Georgia, where you have the Stono Revolt in 1738, 39 in South Carolina, where there's this quite violent uprising where rebels trying to free themselves from enslavement, destroy many plantations and kill some white slave owners in the process. And that, in a sense, kind of proved the Georgia trustees right that we don't want to be like South Carolina. We don't want to have we don't want to have slavery here. We don't want to have a concentration of land here. But in fact, what ends up happening is that the profits to be gained from slave plantations, slave resistance be damned, always outweighs those voices of caution. And we see a similar thing happen in the wake of what is the largest and most successful slave uprising in the history of plantations, and that's the Haitian Revolution. So the Haitian Revolution happens in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, which had, by the mid 1700s, had sort of replaced Jamaica and Barbados as the number one producer of sugar in the Caribbean and in the world economy because of political complications having to do with the French Revolution, an enslaved majority starts a massive slave uprising in Saint-Domingue, which lasts on and off for nearly a decade. It's a very complicated process that involves Napoleon trying to actually reinstate slavery after the revolutionary parliaments had abolished it. They actually defeat Napoleon's biggest army to come to the Americas and establish the hemisphere's first free black republic. This because the connections between the Caribbean and the colonial Americas and now the independent United States, because those connections are so close, connections of trade, connections of culture. Thomas Jefferson has friends and letter writing partners in Saint-Domingue. This episode lands like a dagger in the heart of New World planters. But while some people make the conclusion, see, look at Saint-Domingue, perhaps we should not do this. In fact, the effect that it has in Virginia, where during the Revolution, a lot of people who'd been in favor of slavery kind of catch the revolutionary bug and decide they want to do something to remove slavery as a stain on the garment of the new republic. There's an uptick in voluntary emancipation of slaves. A few large owners of slaves do these big sort of one-off manumissions of all the people they claim to own. But what happens after the Haitian Revolution is that all talk of freeing the slaves kind of has to be silenced and stamped out. Because the lesson that a lot of Virginia enslavers like Thomas Jefferson take is in fact that the French planters were actually kind of at fault for why the revolution happened. A lot of sugar planters in Cuba make the same conclusion, that if they hadn't had loose tongues talking about the rights of man and human equality and freedom and citizenship, they wouldn't have quote unquote kind of brought this violent rebellion upon themselves. So, in fact, the Haitian Revolution actually makes it a lot harder to talk about the possibility of gradually ending slavery in the new nation. And sort of, concretizes the idea that the only way to stay safe now that we have this big slave population is to never talk about freedom. And I think that has a big impact on the new nation.
Hmm. The excuse me, the Atlantic slave trade ends in the United States in 1808, which places an enormous burden on the domestic slave trade. You make that quite clear that that diffuses slavery throughout the states, Alabama, Mississippi, into Texas, as the Cotton Empire grows. We're familiar with that story,
Yeah,
but what you do that is so interesting in this book is you reach the Civil War. Don't spend a lot of time on that. We know that the role of anti-slavery and abolition played in the politics of the 19th century. But your story really gets going with the end of enslavement, if you will, by law. Uh, it's quite clear that enslavement continues by other names after emancipation,
mhm.
but particularly you use the phrase global post-slavery plantation system.
Yeah,
So, in the interest of time here, we're going to gallop along. I want you to talk about how the whole plantation model survived the end of the plantation system, if you will, as we think of it romantically, nostalgically, or even historically in the United States. Talk about Cuba in that
sure.
period between 1865 and 1900. What happens there? How does the notion of the plantation model change and adapt with the end of enslavement?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Dan. By the end of the 1860s, excuse me, by the end of the 1860s, Cuba is now the largest sugar producer in the world, and has also incorporated technologies from Europe's Industrial Revolution and adapted them. So there are these mammoth sugar plantations that are so much larger and technologically more modern than their Barbadian predecessors that were in some senses in a new world that happens during the peak of the African slave trade into Cuba. But because of a bunch of different political reasons I don't have time to get into, slavery is gradually brought to an end in Cuba in the late 1800s. But during that time, slave owners in Cuba, sugar planters in Cuba, are kind of getting like slowly kind of coming to this conclusion that maybe plantations can exist without slavery, because there are a lot of other ways to keep labor cheap and working hard than actual chattel slavery itself. So one of the things that they do is they import tens of thousands of indentured workers from China to staff some of these new sugar plantations. And they're also kind of innovating new ways to legally tie formerly enslaved Black Cubans to plantation work. And they basically design a kind of post-slavery plantation which looks a lot like the sharecropped plantations of the Deep South. They're just doing it with sugar with So basically, these really big sugar planters build new kinds of sugar factories. They leave the farming to sort of, they're called colonos. They're kind of large sharecroppers who then have access to the ex-slave population who has been denied access to land and an independent living. So we get this very profitable, highly kind of powerful and dynamic system of plantation capitalism that's still dependent upon racialized labor exploitation, but not slavery itself. And I think that's a really fateful discovery that happens in Cuba in the 1860s, 1870s, and 1880s, because that's the path that U.S. planters also go down, like let's say particularly in the Mississippi Delta, where you have far more cotton production and a much higher dependence on cotton in the economy than you even had before the Civil War. So there's this big cotton boom that happens in the decades after Reconstruction, where cotton becomes way more important to the Southern economy than it had ever been in the era of so-called King Cotton. And that, of course, is no longer based on the actual ownership of people, but based on a monopoly of land and of using various kind of political and legal machinations to make sure that sharecroppers, now both black and white, are forced to concentrate on selling cotton that large landowners can still sell.
And we think, okay, so emancipation brings freedom, and now people are free, and I'm putting quotes around that, to they're working for wages, or I don't like this job. I can just simply pick up, move my family, and go somewhere else. I'll move to Indiana. I'll go anywhere. I'll move into the city. You make it quite clear that formerly enslaved people in the Caribbean, in the American South, did not have the sort of freedom that we associate with a free labor force. Am I correct in that?
Yeah, you certainly are. Mississippi, for example, passes laws in the early 1900s that more or less make it a crime not to be employed by a white boss.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, we have, the famous crop lien system, and we have the convict labor system, which other scholars have talked about as tantamount to slavery. But I sort of like to talk about the other face of that story because I do think that story is really important and we need to know it. But what I emphasize in the book is that the descendants of enslaved people didn't want to leave. They wanted to stay in the areas that they knew where they had grown up, where they had often raised their children in slavery, but merely to take over control of those lands that they viewed as rightfully theirs and to farm them independently.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So they actually want to, most of them want to stay and make lives for themselves where they are. And so the political struggles that happen in the depths of Jim Crow are often these very sort of, non-glamorous daily struggles over a family who's a sharecropper and they're struggling to buy a small farm for themselves, or they're trying to sort of slowly climb up the ladder out of sharecropping into just being a renter, which means that they own their own tools, they own their own livestock, they rent their land, but otherwise they can kind of do what they want. Because what I emphasize is that coming out of a plantation regime in which white planters equated the sort of capitalist ownership of land with everything that mattered, with honor, with dignity, with freedom, with citizenship. A lot of the descendants of enslaved people didn't necessarily see having your name on a title at the courthouse as the most important thing. What they wanted was daily on the ground freedom from white supervision, right? Obviously, the best way to have done that would have been to have actual title to land, but they were denied that by the post-Reconstruction governments in the late 1860s, or by the Reconstruction governments in the late 1860s. But in the absence of that, what they wanted was like on the ground autonomy to the extent that that might be possible. And what I argue is that in the depths of Jim Crow in Georgia and Alabama, a large number of the descendants of enslaved people are actually able to achieve de facto freedom on the ground to plant what they want and in many ways live how they want in spite of all the legal disadvantages and all the oppression.
Hmm.
And so, in a sense, I think that historians, although like the cruelties, the brutalities, the injustices of the Jim Crow South should never be forgotten, I think that in a sense we've gotten it wrong in assuming that the planters succeeded in winning back the power and dominance over daily life that they had enjoyed before the Civil War. Because I think, owing in part to Black resistance, they actually failed to win, even though they have rigged the political and economic system to their own advantage. They're not themselves wealthy or powerful enough to exert a sort of new kind of slavery over the majority of African American rural people in Georgia and Alabama.
You make an important point, and I appreciate you bringing up the Stono Rebellion because we should emphasize throughout the entire 500-year period that we're talking about, the enslaved, whoever they were never passive. They were
Right.
always active in resisting this system in any way they can. I want to read, as we move into the 20th century now, I want to read this from your book. You say, across the span of what Time magazine founder Henry Luce famously called the American century, U.S. based conglomerates like the Sugar Trust, nonprofits like the Rockefeller Foundation, and government agencies like the Department of Agriculture laid out the steps for economic development elsewhere in the world. This book shows that they consistently put the plantation approach to agriculture at the center of their foreign investments as well as their economic development programs. And I thought, well, how's he going to do that? Because that's in the introduction. And boy, you do. Take us through what happens in the 20th century in places far removed from the American South, where we think you've alluded to it already. You talked about California, and bring us all the way up to the present, near where you are in Gainesville and what's
Mhm.
happening there with Jesse Jewell, and even beyond that, up to the present moment in terms of what's happening globally as we're trying to get away from fossil fuel. And you remind us at the end of the book that in trying to do that, we are still sort of fastened to this system. That's a lot to ask and a lot of ground to cover. But again, I want to be mindful of your time. But in some ways, this is the most fascinating part of your book, Dan. Go ahead.
Yeah. I cannot answer all of those questions. You just gave a wonderful tease of the second half of the book.
Mm.
But I kind of agree with you, Stan. I do feel like, I mean, maybe it's because we both have more like specialized in antebellum or colonial issues. So writing the second half of the book that's really about how plantations kind of grow and expand after the end of slavery were in some senses the most interesting for me to write because I was surprised by a lot of what I was finding out. Only because you're at the Georgia Historical Society, and I haven't talked about this much. Let's just focus on this poultry story.
Hmm.
So after the Civil War, Georgia's economy is in ruins, and parts of Georgia that had not really been part of the cotton plantation before the Civil War kind of get sucked into cotton monoculture in the 1880s and 1890s, really. And so for the first time, white majority parts of the state, like where I am in Athens, anywhere north of Athens, basically, like
Hmm.
Jackson County, Hall County, Forsyth County, the suburbs around Atlanta, they go from places where the majority of the people living there were small yeoman farmers who didn't grow much cotton at all. They didn't own many slaves, if any at all, and were mostly independent landowners. Because of the economic ruination of Confederate defeat, many of them sort of by necessity fall into dependence on growing cotton and actually lose access to their lands and turn into tenants and sharecroppers in the late 1800s. And so I think it's really interesting that the plantation system, which for its first couple hundred years of existence had mostly pushed small white farmers out of the way, in this time period actually sucks them into its maw for the first time. And so the sharecropping populations of the post-Reconstruction South are both white and black. I think too often we forget that. So what happens there is what seems to inevitably happen with plantations in general. There's a new huge dependence on cotton sharecropping, which lasts all the way up until the Great Depression. And then there's this big crash in cotton prices because of the boll weevil, and small white farmers, many sharecroppers, are in dire straits. In the depths of the Great Depression, in walks another one of these merchants who I talk about, named Jesse Dixon Jewell, centered in Gainesville, Georgia, still called the poultry capital to this day. And he offers these distressed small landowners and sharecroppers a way out of the cotton trap, and that's to start raising chicks for him. Instead of depending on cotton, he sells them grain as chicken feed that's become really cheap, and he gives them chicks to raise for him on contract. And that really is the sort of birth moment of the system of cheap poultry in America, and in some senses the fast food industry as well. Because the number of birds being raised in Georgia just grows by incredible leaps and bounds throughout the Great Depression. And by the 1950s, a place like Hall County, most of the cotton areas, those small farmers and landowners are now chicken broiler raisers for this new emerging kind of fast food economy in the Americas that really takes full shape in the Cold War. So I think it matters that both the booms of plantations and the busts of plantations always leave us with these really kind of influential echoes. So, in other words, it's the failures of the cotton plantation system that lay the groundwork for the system of cheap poultry in America, because these eventually Jesse Dixon Jewell and a bunch of his competitors will grow into these highly concentrated meat processing companies, like Purdue and others, who are all located in former cotton grounds. They take the neediness of former cotton farmers, and turn sort of small white landowners into this. They call it a new form of sharecropping that they get sort of shoved into unfairly. So they get stuck in that, whereas former black sharecroppers, particularly black women, become the first major workforce on the killing floors of these new big poultry processing industries. Also, almost all of which are located in former cotton growing areas. And that, together with the growth of trucking and with new kinds of fast food restaurants, that really provides like the first episode where we get like cheap meat to the masses. Long before you have a full centralization of the cattle economy in America, it happens with poultry. And it also happens with pork, in North Carolina, also former cotton plantation growing areas. So I think we also need to see the plantation, as the sort of centerpiece making possible the growth, of this new kind of American industrial food economy.
And I think it's important to emphasize also, you mentioned black women, but of course, we know that the other people working in these places, particularly in places like Gainesville, are
Yeah,
immigrants,
right.
and Hispanic immigrants by in large measure. And you make it, you tell some horror stories, of course, of these people, and the conditions under which they labor,
Yeah,
and make the argument. I think that this is all still based upon, we use the word, I use the word exploitation at the beginning of the
yeah.
resources, the labor, of markets, of producing this one thing. Um, do you see this? And I know I think I know the answer, but for the benefit of our audience, I'm just going to ask: do you see this just going on and on into the future? That this is just will always be very, as you mentioned, we even talk about it. You talk about AI in your book,
Yeah.
and reliance upon AI. That all of this still somehow just locks in this model of the plantation that you defined. As we approach the U.S. 250th coming up in July, and we
Yeah.
think this great, As you see us moving forward, do you ever see us somehow shaking out of this model of the plantation?
Mm.
I'm not asking you to predict the future, but your
Yeah.
book, as you read it, I told somebody, I said, this is a terrific book, but in many ways it's very depressing. And I don't really, I mean, it's just the world we live in. You have, as all good scholars do, you get people, I think, to stand on new ground
Mm.
and see things in a way they haven't thought about them before. And your book does that. So in some ways, I guess what I'm asking is
Mm.
to those who explain to us, if you can, in snapshot, I don't want to be mindful of your time here, how this goes on into the 21st century.
Yeah. There's this argument that we've been having, and I think it's a good argument to have, like on social media, for example, about the whole phenomenon of plantation weddings and plantation nostalgia and this kind of whitewashing of the plantation. And I think that's an important argument to have. And obviously, I'm on the side that says we shouldn't do that. That's very that's very problematic and kind of sort of not seeing the reality or kind of suppressing the reality of kind of suffering and brutality at the heart of that whole system. But I think the problem is even more deeply rooted than we think because of the seduction of this idea that you can always use the plantation to kind of make cheap goods in this very attractive way. That plantations aren't just a part of the past, but they're still a part of the present, and they're still a part of the future because, in part, the growth of interest in alternative fuels and the growth in pressures on the world's electricity grid with artificial intelligence. And so, from the perspective of energy companies, it's an all hands on deck situation. So, one of the major new branches of alternative fuels is using sugarcane based ethanol to make electricity and to make fuel for vehicles. So, what we have seen since the 1990s is a new sugar boom in the American origin point of sugar plantations, and that's in Brazil, where now the biggest sugar planters in the world are not sort of exiled aristocrats from England, but they're big petroleum conglomerates like British Petroleum, um, who own these mammoth sugar plantations that are both still used to make sweetener for our industrialized food system, but also used to make ethanol to power these sort of like always growing electricity grid and fuel needs. And they're still using racialized labor. They're using large numbers of migrant workers from impoverished areas of northeastern Brazil, trapping them in unfair labor contracts where they're still cutting cane to way too many hours a day. And that is, in some senses, to power our kind of ultra modern system of capitalist energy needs. And so I kind of end the book with that because we see ourselves sort of looking to the future of the economic system, and somehow plantations are still there at the center of it. And so I don't have an answer for what happens in the future. I more put that on the table as what, look at
Yep.
this. Why is
Mhm.
this still, why is this still at the center?
Yeah, you actually say plowing up rainforests, peat bogs, savannas, and grasslands worldwide so that there is enough ethanol to power lots of industry and transport may actually be worse for the climate than sticking with fossil fuels. That's just near the end of the book that you just wow, and you make the case that that is so. And there's so much more in here, Dan, that we could talk about. You actually touch on the subject of reparations at one point.
Mm,
You talk about something called the ruse of black surplus and black needlessness. There is the research and the amount of literature that you had to absorb to write this book. Anybody interested in this subject should not only read the book, but then mind the footnotes for so much of the literature upon which this is based and that you are standing on. I do want to be mindful of your time here and bring this to a close. And I sort of touched on it already, but where do you see, as we do approach, and this is more of a question, I guess, it's the job of historians to kind of get people to sometimes focus on things they'd rather not.
mm,
As we approach the US 250, this entire year, which is not only a celebration, but is also a commemoration. We know that slavery and freedom marched hand in hand from 1776 forward. Where do you see how important was this thing called the plantation in creating this country that we are commemorating now? In
Yeah,
all of it, in all of the institutions, economic, political, social, how important is
right.
the plantation?
I mean, I think it's right there at the center, and I this is why I focused on Virginia during the colonial, but especially the Revolutionary era, um, because to a man, Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, James Madison, Randolph, are all tobacco planters and slave owners, and the intellectual architects and George Washington too, of course, and Thomas Jefferson, if I didn't say him, are all intellectual architects of both the Declaration of Independence, but in particular the Constitution. And the Bill of Rights. I mean, everyone knows how central Virginians were to that process. And so I think there's a really hard story there. But also, if we're focusing on the Black freedom struggle, if we're focusing on the ways in which, countless numbers of enslaved people in Georgia and South Carolina took the opportunity of British incursions to flee from their owners and take up the promise of British liberation if they would side with the British. And just so basically, like in Georgia and South Carolina, for example, during the constitutional debates, they like during the Articles of the Confederation, if I remember correctly, the Atlantic slave trade had been shut down completely because there was already a major sense that it was, highly brutal and unethical, and also a bunch of people who didn't want more, quote unquote, Negroes in the country had sort of gotten together to shut it down. But from the perspective of the Deep South delegates, the reopening of the Atlantic slave trade in the Constitution, which the Constitution does, it opens it up until 1808, another 20 years, is kind of non-negotiable, in part because so many enslaved people had struck out for freedom during the upheavals in the Carolinas and in Georgia. And so there's also a lot of really inspiring stories there in that freedom seeking, that can and should also be center stage, I think, in the 250th.
Mm-hmm. Great reminder. A great reminder. The book is called In the Shadow of the Great House, A History of the Plantation in America. It was published by W. Norton on March 17th of this year. It is a terrific, provocative, thought-provoking book that is going to create a lot of conversation. I have a feeling that graduate students for generations are going to have to come to terms with this, and really all of us should. The author is Daniel Rood of the University of Georgia. Dan, thanks so much for coming on here, and continued good luck in everything you're doing.
Thank you, Stan. You too. Pleasure talking to you.
My thanks to Daniel Rood for joining me on this podcast. You can find out more about his book at www.norton.com. The hardest working producer and engineer in show business, the producer of this podcast, as well as the czar of our Tallahassee office, is our very own and indispensable Brendan Crellin. Learn everything about the Georgia Historical Society at georgiahistory.com and the Georgia History Festival at georgiahistoryfestival.org. If you're a fan of Today in Georgia History, and who isn't, check it out at the completely redesigned website at todayingeorgiahistory.org, and you can see it and hear it currently airing twice a day on TV and radio on Georgia Public Broadcasting. You can find this podcast anywhere you can find podcasts, including Spotify, YouTube, and YouTube Music. You can also find Off the Beaten Path on the podcast app on your phone, and I would like to ask you to please leave a review on the Apple Podcast app, which would be most helpful and appreciated. If you enjoyed this podcast, please follow, subscribe, and share with a friend. And drop me a line at sdeaton@georgiahistory.com. Be sure and like Off the Beaten Path on Facebook as well. You can also treat yourself to every podcast, every blog, and every video entitled Dispatches from Off the Beaten Path at deatonpath.georgiahistory.com. Stay safe, stay strong. I'm Stan Deaton with the Georgia Historical Society. As always, thank you for listening.